Korean religion, philosophy, and intellectual tradition. Confucianism.
In this next section, we are going to examine why Buddhism fell out of favor with the state and why the next dynasty, the Joseon dynasty, decided to adopt Confucianism as its official state ideology. We're also going to look at the historical introduction and development of Confucian ideology in Korea and how it again adapted to the local context.
Is Confucianism a religion or a philosophy?
Confucianism itself has a very long tradition dating back to the ancient period. And it is basically a system of ethics and rituals to create order in society, to organize society. And it is this ideology that becomes state ideology during the Joseon dynasty. Confucius himself lived from approximately 551 to 479 BCE. And he lived at a time when he was a minor official and the government was essentially falling apart. So he goes into exile in order to try to ponder the reasons for the fall of the dynasty and how to create a good government and to how to order society so that these kinds of mistakes don't happen again. Confucian ethics value harmony over equality, so it is actually quite hierarchical. And it is considered to be natural, for example, for the king to be higher than the ruler, for the husband to be higher than the wife, for the parent to be higher than the child. So this hierarchy or patriarchy is considered natural and therefore moral. So because a parent should act like a parent and has certain responsibilities to their child, they should not try to behave like a friend or as a contemporary or peer to their child. If they do, this is considered to be very unnatural, and this is where instability and the system starts to break down. There are also key virtues that are emphasized in Confucian ideology, for example, sincerity, integrity, reverence, mindfulness, benevolence, humanity. These are key virtues in Confucian ideology. I refer to Confucianism as an ideology and an intellectual tradition rather than as a religion, because there is no powerful God or deity within this intellectual tradition. Within Confucianism, also, proper etiquette is necessary to ensure a harmonious society. So everybody needs to know what their role is and the appropriate behavior assigned to that role. Confucianism was influenced also during the Three Kingdoms period to Korea. And we see that it was quite influential. For example, in 372, the National Confucian Academy, the Taehak, was established in Goguryeo. And in 682, the National Confucian College was established in Silla. So even in the ancient period, the Koreans valued Confucian ideology and found it very useful, and it coexisted peacefully with Buddhism. During the Goryeo dynasty, again, Confucianism also played a role. It played a role in political reform because of its emphasis on its principles for governing the state and recruiting officials. What kind of standards are there to recruit the proper officials to rule the country? And we see that there is this, again, coexistence with Buddhism. How is this the case? Well, Buddhism tends to focus on the spiritual and afterworld and is more of a religion, whereas Confucianism is an ideology focused on this life and how to create a well-functioning government and orderly, harmonious society. However, at the beginning of the next dynasty, the Joseon dynasty, the founder of the Joseon dynasty felt that the previous dynasty in Goryeo had failed because Buddhism had become too influential and too powerful. So because Buddhism had been able to amass all of this wealth, and most of it was tax-free, once the Joseon dynasty was established, there was a reconsideration of what the official state ideology should be. And so the architects of the Confucian dynasty turned to Confucianism. So there was a focus on Confucian relationships and virtues. There are the 5 relationships. There are certain key virtues such as filial piety. But Confucian ideology also at this particular time provided political legitimacy, because at the beginning of the dynasty, since the founder Lee Seung-ge really needed this political legitimacy to get the dynasty started off on the right foot and on a solid foundation, the official ideology of Confucianism was adopted, and this was also the official ideology of the Ming Dynasty in China. So at the beginning of Joseon, land reform was conducted, and it stripped the monasteries of their land because this land was not on the tax rolls, and any peasant farmers on land owned by temples. So we have a redistribution of the land, and because now the government is seizing this land, this is redirecting the taxes to, or the income from this land from the private sector to the public sector. So there are political attacks. You can imagine that this was a very contentious policy, but many of the temples and the monasteries were driven out of the capital of Joseon, and the result is that we have a decline in the religious fervor and official state support of Buddhism. So just because the Joseon dynasty decided to adopt Confucianism as its official state ideology does not mean that Buddhism just disappeared. In fact, if we look at contemporary Korean society, Buddhism is still very much well and alive. So what this means is that at the beginning of the Joseon dynasty, the Joseon dynasty decided to withdraw its official state support. But even still, there were some rulers who looked favorably upon Buddhism. So, for example, Queen Munjeong was a devout Buddhist, and during the Hideyoshi invasions or the Imjin Wars in 1592 and 1598, the Buddhist monks were very active in fighting against the Japanese and helping their country, and they were rewarded by the state for their participation in the defense of the country. But eventually what we see is that Confucian ideology it usurps Buddhism and takes precedence over all other intellectual traditions. And we have the creation of the hereditary Yangban class, which was the officials divided by the civil officials and the military officials, but really it is the literati and the civil officials who acquire the most prestige and respect during the Joseon dynasty. And it is the use of Confucian rituals in government business that defines the Confucian state. And different Confucian schools and different varieties of Confucian ideology emerge and develop during the Joseon Dynasty. And so it is during the Joseon Dynasty that we have a resurgence of Neo-Confucianism. Neo-Confucianism was a type of Confucianism that had been popular in China during the Song dynasties and later on, and so it is adapted and developed within the Joseon Dynasty. It is a more metaphysical type of Confucianism, but the focus really is on proper relationships. So with the development of Confucian ideology in the Joseon, as we get towards the latter part of Joseon, there are also different types of Confucian schools or Neo-Confucian schools that are developed. And this is in response to the changing historical circumstances. Because there was social unrest and social problems, these new Neo-Confucian schools, they begin to respond and try to find solutions to these problems. And many of them recommended institutional reform and were a critique of the way that society had been currently structured. So as a response to these socioeconomic changes, we see different types of Confucianism, such as practical learning, or shirak, which was a more practical type, a move away from the physical type of Confucian ideology that really focused on practical solutions to the problems in society. Within this school, they advocated for no social status distinctions, and that officials should be recruited based on merit rather than on lineage. And because it was more pragmatic, they developed their own methodology. There was another school of this new type of Confucianism that emerged in the urban areas of Seoul, and this was Northern Learning. And they were a group of scholars that had traveled to Qing, China, and they saw the commercial development there, and they felt that this was very beneficial to the people. So they recommended that Joseon adapt some of those same kinds of policies and start to encourage commerce and manufacturing in Joseon. They also advocated for equal educational opportunities, and that anybody, not just the elite, the Yangban, but that all people should be able to have access to education. So we've gone over some of the fundamental principles of Confucianism and some of the basic values that are emphasized in this ideology, how it was introduced into Korea, and why Neo-Confucianism eventually became state ideology during the Joseon Dynasty. But over this 500-year period, by the end of the Joseon Dynasty, we see that there are new types of Neo-Confucian schools that are developed.
These are the keywords for this class: Confucianism, Confucian ethos, Neo-Confucianism, practical learning.